You know that feeling? When you're looking at a topic, maybe something like Irish Neolithic archaeology, and it just seems huge, almost impossible to get your head around.
Yeah, completely overwhelming sometimes.
But what if you could just sort of cut through all that complexity, get
Yeah.
straight to the really fascinating stuff?
That's the idea.
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do for you today. This is our deep dive into this incredible period. We're pulling out the key insights, the aha moments, so you can walk away feeling like you've really got a handle on it and maybe feel a bit amazed too.
Our focus is the Neolithic period in Ireland. It's a really pivotal time, running roughly from 4000 BC down to about 2500 BC.
Right.
And we'll be digging into the archaeology, the evidence that sheds light on this era, things like the big shift from the earlier Mesolithic lifestyle.
Hunter-gatherers, right.
Exactly, to settled communities, their material culture, the stuff they made and used, and of course those incredible megalithic monuments, the big stone structures that still dominate parts of the landscape today.
Right. And our mission here isn't to turn you into an expert overnight.
No, definitely not.
But it is to get a grasp on the really fundamental changes. How did people's lives actually transform? What can we piece together about, their day-to-day existence?
And the legacy, the meaning behind those massive stone structures they left behind. What's the enduring significance?
Exactly. Okay, let's start unpacking this. Let's kick off with what people often call the Neolithic Revolution. What did that actually look like in Ireland?
Well, at its core, the Neolithic Revolution was this massive shift, really fundamental in how people lived, moving away from being nomadic hunter-gatherers.
Following the herds, finding plants.
Right, towards being settled agricultural communities.
Yeah.
Farming. And this wasn't just about, new ways to get food. It completely reshaped society.
How so?
Well, a key part of it is what archaeologists call the Neolithic package. Think of it as a bundle of innovations that arrive together.
Okay.
So you've got agriculture itself, growing cereals, raising domesticated animals, but also new technologies like pottery.
Which you wouldn't really carry around if you were nomadic.
Precisely. Too heavy, too fragile. Then you have polished stone axes, much better for chopping down trees, timber houses, proper permanent homes. And crucially, this is also when we see the first megalithic monuments appearing.
Wow, so it's all linked together.
Very interconnected. The ability to settle down and farm, for instance, that makes it practical, even necessary to have things like pottery for storing grain or cooking.
You can really see how one change enables another, and this completely new way of life.
Yeah.
It must have meant a totally different relationship with the environment, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Neolithic marks the first time humans had a really significant widespread impact on the Irish landscape, primarily through clearing huge areas of forest. They needed land for farming, for grazing animals, for building their settlements.
Right.
And that had a profound, lasting effect. We see evidence from Britain around this time, interestingly, of a major dietary shift. People seem to rely less on marine foods, like fish and shellfish, and much more on land-based resources, the crops and animals they were raising.
Makes sense.
And while we still need a bit more specific data for Ireland, it's highly likely a similar dietary change happened here as farming became, the main way of life.
Okay, so these new farming methods, the animals, the crops, where do they actually come from? They didn't just magically spring up in Ireland, did they?
No. The evidence we have points very strongly towards agriculture, and the domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, pigs, and the crops like wheat and barley they were brought to Ireland.
By who?
By new groups of people arriving, probably from Britain initially, but ultimately their origins trace back to mainland Europe and even the Near East, where farming first developed.
Huh. Do we have early proof of this?
We do. There's some really interesting, very early evidence of domesticated cattle, for example, at a site called Ferreter's Cove in County Kerry. That could date back as far as 4350 BC.
Wow, that's incredibly early, pushing the date back. And what about modern science? Can things like DNA analysis tell us more about these newcomers?
Ancient DNA has been, revolutionary for understanding this period.
How so?
The studies show a really substantial migration of people into Ireland. Early farmers whose genetic ancestry is largely traced back to the Near East.
So a big movement of people, not just ideas spreading.
Exactly. It looks like this influx of people significantly altered the existing gene pool of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who were already in Ireland.
A replacement, then?
Not entirely. There's also clear genetic evidence of interbreeding, of mixing between the incoming farmers and the existing hunter-gatherer groups. So it was complex. Interaction, admixture. not a simple wipeout.
Okay.
But the genetics really bolster the idea that migration, what we call demic diffusion, the movement of people, was the main driver for the Neolithic transition here. More so than just local hunter-gatherers deciding to adopt farming, which is cultural adoption. The DNA points strongly towards migration.
That makes a lot of sense. And getting here, I mean, Ireland's an island. How did they manage that with animals and seeds?
It almost certainly had to be by sea. These migrations would have involved pretty deliberate, organized efforts, transporting people, livestock, which is not easy in small boats, and crucial seed corn across the Irish Sea.
A major undertaking.
Definitely. And it's also worth noting the climate was generally improving around this time, becoming a bit warmer. That likely helped these new farming practices to actually take hold and succeed in Ireland.
Okay, right. So, new people arrive, they bring farming, they need land. This gets us to how they started settling in and, well, physically changing Ireland's landscape. It wasn't just planting a few seeds, was it? They were really reshaping things.
No, absolutely. Fundamentally reshaping.
Yeah.
One of the most immediate and visible changes was large-scale woodland clearance. Deforestation.
Bit fields.
Exactly. Fields for crops, pasture for their animals, and their key tool for this was that new technology, the polished stone axe. Much, much more effective for felling trees than anything available in the Mesolithic.
I can imagine.
There's also some evidence they might have used fire to help clear vegetation, a technique sometimes called the Lardrum system, managed burning.
And we can see this in the environmental record.
Yes, quite clearly. If you look at pollen analysis from peat bogs and lake sediments from this period, you see a distinct pattern starting around 4000 BC. Tree pollen decreases sharply.
Fewer trees.
Right. And pollen from grasses and herbs, plants that thrive in open land, increases significantly. It's a clear signature of the spread of agricultural landscapes.
It's actually quite amazing to think of them doing that, transforming the landscape on that scale, mostly with stone axes and maybe fire. What specific crops and animals were driving this?
The main crops they brought in were cereals like emmer wheat and barley, both whole and naked varieties of barley, actually, and also flax.
Flax or linen?
Likely for its fibers, yes, but maybe also the whaley seeds. Then, a bit later in the Neolithic, we start to see oats and rye appearing, though initially they might have just been weeds growing among the main crops rather than deliberately cultivated.
Okay. And the animals?
They brought domesticated cattle, sheep, and pigs. These quickly became absolutely central to their way of life. Milk, meat, hides, wool, all essential resources.
And we have some really incredible evidence of just how organized this farming could be, don't we? Like those field systems up in Mayo.
Yes, the side fields in County Mayo. They are truly exceptional.
What are they exactly?
It's this vast network of stone walls, fields, enclosures preserved incredibly well under a layer of blanket bog. They date back to maybe 3700, 3500 BC.
Wow.
And the scale, the regularity of the layout, it's huge. It suggests a really high degree of planning and communal effort. These weren't just random plots, it was organized land management, mainly for grazing livestock, especially cattle, it seems.
So not just small family farms, but maybe larger community projects.
It certainly implies a significant level of communal organization, cooperative work on a large scale.
That's incredible to picture that level of cooperation so early. But clearing all that forest, changing the land use, that must have had consequences beyond just, fewer trees, environmental impacts.
Definitely. While it opened up land for farming, it also led to changes in the soil composition, and it affected how water moved through the landscape, the hydrology.
How so?
Well, in some areas, particularly upland areas like shade fields, these changes, maybe combined with shifts in climate over time, contributed to the formation of blanket bog. That peat bog grew over and eventually buried those ancient field systems, which is ironically why they're so well preserved.
Nature preserving the evidence of its own transformation.
In a way, yes, but it's important not to see it as just a one-way street of destruction. There's also evidence from pollen records of periods where forests regenerated in some areas.
Oh.
It suggests that maybe land was left fallow, allowed to recover, or that farming practices shifted over time. It points to a more dynamic, evolving relationship with the landscape, not just continuous, unchecked exploitation.
Right, adapting over time. Okay, so they're settling down, clearing land, farming. What about their homes? Must have been quite different from the temporary shelters of the Mesolithic.
Oh, a world of difference. Moving to a settled farming life meant building more substantial, permanent homes. And the typical Neolithic house in Ireland was a rectangular timber structure.
Timber, not stone.
Primarily timber, yes. We found archaeological traces, post holes, foundation trenches of around 80 of these houses on about 50 different sites across the country.
And were they living in villages or isolated farms?
A mix, really. Sometimes you find houses individually, sometimes in small clusters, sometimes even larger groups. It suggests different scales of settlement, maybe different community structures.
Okay. And how were they actually built? Must have required some decent woodworking skills.
Absolutely. They clearly knew their timber. Archaeologically, we often just find the footprint,
Yeah.
the dark stains in the soil where foundation trenches were dug or where timber posts once stood.
Right.
The walls were typically made from split oak timbers or planks set vertically into these trenches. Or sometimes they used wattle and daub, basically a woven lattice of branches plastered with a mix of clay and straw.
Sturdy stuff.
Yeah, often these walls were strong enough to support the roof directly. The roof itself was likely thatched, probably with reeds or straw. Some of the larger houses might have had internal posts for extra support, maybe even lofts for storage or sleeping.
So proper houses.
Yeah.
What about the layout inside? Were they just big open rectangles?
Mostly rectangular or squarish, yeah. Typical dimensions might be around, say, 6 to 8 meters long by 4 to 7 meters wide, though some bigger ones exist.
Okay.
Inside, we often find evidence of internal partitions dividing walls, suggesting they created separate spaces within the house, maybe different activity areas or sleeping quarters.
Makes sense.
Doorways were usually just simple openings, often positioned to face away from the prevailing winds, which is quite practical. And a central hearth, a fireplace, was pretty standard for cooking, heating, light.
Thought it all.
Absolutely. We also find lots of pits and smaller stake holes inside and around the houses, used for various things, presumably storage, supporting looms or other internal fittings, that kind of thing.
Are there any specific sites that give us a really good picture? Examples?
Yeah, several are quite informative. Ballynagely in County Tyrone had a nice rectangular house about 6 by 6.5 meters. Wattle and daub walls, evidence suggesting a thatched roof. And it was linked to a specific type of pottery, Ballymarloware.
Okay.
At Corbally in County Kildare, they found a whole cluster, 7 similar houses together. Lochgar in Limerick is a fantastic area. Loads of evidence, different house types, some rectangular, some circular, using stone, turf, reeds, timber, a real variety.
Adaptations, maybe.
Probably local adaptations and changes over time. At one spot in Lochgar, Tankardstown South, they found a plank-built house that had burned down, preserving details, and another really large one over 15 meters long with extra rooms or annexes.
Wow.
And up in County Derry at Thornhill, there were at least 5 houses found enclosed within timber fences, palisades. Suggests a more defined, maybe defensive settlement.
Sounds like there was a pretty common idea of what a house should be: rectangular, timber, but with local twists in size or materials.
Exactly that. The widespread similarity in the basic design, as quite a few researchers have noted, points to a shared cultural template, a common understanding of how to build a proper house. But then you get local variations using stone where it was plentiful, like at Lochgar, slight differences in size, maybe curved walls sometimes. It shows both cultural connection and local adaptation.
And these houses weren't just shelters, were they? They sound like the real hub of daily life.
Totally. They were multifunctional centers, cooking, eating, sleeping, obviously, but also making and repairing tools, maybe weaving, processing food, possibly even sheltering vulnerable young animals at times.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something else quite intriguing. Sometimes archaeologists find broken pottery or stone tools deliberately placed in the foundation trenches or post holes before the house was built, or maybe when it was abandoned.
Why would they do that?
It suggests these houses might have had a ritual significance too, maybe foundation offerings, ceremonies marking the beginning or end of the house's life. It hints that the domestic space was also tied into their belief systems.
Fascinating. Okay, so we have these houses. We know they're farming. What can we piece together about their actual day-to-day? What were they eating? What crafts were happening inside those homes?
Well, diet-wise, the foundation was definitely their farmed resources. The crops, emmer wheat, barley, and the products from their animals. Meat and milk from cattle, sheep, and pigs.
And we find direct evidence.
Oh, yeah. Animal bones, charred grains at sites like Ballynagally and Lochgar. And this is important, they didn't just abandon wild foods.
Still foraging?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hazelnuts are incredibly common finds on Neolithic sites. They were clearly a major food source. Also, other wild fruits and nuts, crabapples, blackberries, sloes, maybe leafy plants like fat hen, and fishing and collecting shellfish definitely continued, especially for communities near the coast or rivers.
So a mixed strategy, really.
Very much so. While the British evidence suggests that overall reliance on marine foods decreased compared to the Mesolithic, it didn't disappear. We still need more detailed isotopic analysis from Irish human remains to see the exact balance here, but it was likely a mix.
Okay, and processing all this food, making flour, cooking.
We find saddle querns stone slabs with a rubbing stone used for grinding grain into flour. Simple but effective. And pottery, as we said, was vital. For storage, sure, but also for cooking.
Boiling things, stews.
That's the likely scenario. Boiling, making stews, porridges.
Rip.
Much easier with ceramic pots than trying to do it in skin bags or baskets with hot stones, which is what people might have done before pottery, though the exact methods are still debated sometimes.
Right, and other crafts. Done at home.
Pottery making itself seems to have been a household-level craft. The techniques, coil building, open bonfire firing, are manageable on a small scale. No need for massive industrial kilns.
Okay.
Making and maintaining stone tools, especially flint ones for everyday tasks, also happened at the household or settlement level. We often find lithic scatters, little concentrations of waste flakes from knapping flint, showing where that work took place.
Little workshop areas.
Kind of, yeah. And then later in the Neolithic, we start seeing the first solid evidence for textile production. Finds of spindle, whorls, weights for spinning thread at sites like Craigendevansky and Ballyalton.
Spinning what? Flax? Wool?
Probably both. They were growing flax and they had sheep, so wool seems very likely too. The fact that these essential crafts, pottery, basic tool making, maybe spinning, seem to happen decentrally suggests a good degree of self-sufficiency at the household or local community level.
Okay, that paints a clearer picture of life inside those settlements. So moving on to the objects themselves, the material culture, pottery seems like a really big one for the Irish Neolithic.
Huge. Pottery is a real hallmark of the period here. And it wasn't just for cooking pots. It served domestic roles, yes, but also, really importantly, ritual and funerary purposes. We see distinct traditions emerging and changing over that 1,000+ years.
Right. So what are the main styles we should know about? What should we look out for?
Okay, the earliest major type is generally called Western Neolithic ware. Dates from about 4000 BC, maybe down to 3300 BC. This is the pottery associated with those first farming communities.
What's it like?
Typically, it's round-bottomed bowls, often quite smooth, well-finished, relatively thin walls, quite hard-fired, usually dark in color.
Okay.
Within that, there are specific shapes. Early on, you get carinated bowls. They have a sharp angle or a carination in the profile. Often undecorated, good examples from pits at Kilcoman.
Right.
Then you get regional variations, like Lyle's Hill style and Ballymarla style, mostly found up in County Antrim. And another important one, Ballyalton bowls. These often have decoration made by pressing cords into the wet clay, and they're frequently found in court tombs.
Ah, okay, so a link between a pottery style and a specific tomb type already. What comes after Western Neolithic ware?
Next major tradition is Caro-Keel ware. This is strongly associated with the passage tomb builders, so roughly 3500 down to maybe 2800 BC.
And it looks different.
Oh, very different. It's generally much thicker, coarser pottery, lots of grit added to the clay. The typical shapes are open bowls or cup-like vessels,
Decoration.
often heavily decorated, lots of impressed patterns or incised lines. There's a characteristic technique called stab and drag, where a tool is stabbed in and then dragged across the surface. The motif spirals, chevrons sometimes seem to echo the megalithic art carved on the tombstones themselves.
Wow.
And another thing about Caro-Keel ware, a lot of it shows signs of being burnt, suggests it was often placed on the funeral pyres with the dead.
A specific funerary pottery.
Yep.
Okay, and towards the end of the Neolithic, more changes?
Yes. In the later Neolithic, say from about 2800 BC onwards, new styles appear. We get grooved ware. This has incised or grooved geometric patterns, and it often turns up at specific ritual sites like henges or timber circles.
Right.
And then, right at the transition to the Bronze Age, around 2500 BC, beaker pottery arrives. Very distinctive inverted bell shape, often elaborately decorated in horizontal zones using combs, cords, or incision.
And beakers are linked to.
They're often found in the latest type of megalithic tomb, the wedge tombs, but also in new kinds of single burials. And significantly, beaker pottery is often associated with the very first appearance of metal objects, copper knives, gold ornaments. It marks a real cultural shift.
It's amazing how pottery charts these changes. How are they actually making it? All by hand.
All handmade, yes. Primarily using the coiling technique, building up the pot with rolls of clay, then smoothing them together. Firing was done in simple open bonfires or perhaps very basic clamp kilns, just a heap of fuel over the pots.
And the decoration?
Various methods. Incising lines with a sharp point, pressing things into the wet clay cords, fingertips, the ends of bones. That's where you get cord impressed or fingertip impressed decoration. Sometimes adding small strips or lumps of clay called lugs, maybe for handling or just decoration.
You mentioned the different use domestic, ritual, funerary. Can archaeologists actually tell what a specific pot was used for, beyond just finding it in a tomb?
Well, the context is the biggest clue. Finding Balialton bowls consistently in court tombs is strong evidence for a ritual funerary role. Same for caracoleware in passage tombs, or beakers in wedge tombs and single graves.
Okay.
But we can also do scientific analysis. Residue analysis looks for traces of organic materials preserved in the fabric of the pottery.
Like what?
Fats, proteins, plant waxes. It can sometimes tell us if a pot held milk or meat stew or perhaps some kind of alcoholic brew or specific plant offerings. It's like getting a chemical fingerprint of its last contents.
Wow, that's like forensic archaeology. And can we tell where the clay came from, where pots traded?
Sometimes, yes, through petrological analysis. That involves looking at a thin section of the pottery under a microscope to identify the specific minerals in the clay and the temper, the grit added to it.
And that tells you.
It can often pinpoint the geological source of the materials, so we can figure out if a pot was made using local clays, or if the materials or maybe the finished pot came from somewhere else. This helps us map out exchange networks. There's a famous example in Britain of Gabroic pottery from Cornwall being traded over huge distances. We might find similar patterns in Ireland.
So pottery is clearly way more than just containers. It's wrapped up in their identity, their traditions, rituals, maybe even social status. That link between styles and tomb types is really powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, alongside pottery, stone tools. Still crucial in the Neolithic, obviously, but we see big changes there too, especially with those polished stone axes.
Absolutely. Stone tools remain fundamental, and the polished stone axe is one of the defining technologies of the Neolithic. What's really fascinating is their choice of specific raw materials. Like porcelainite, a very hard fine-grained stone found at Tibuli Mountain and on Rathlin Island, both in County Antrim. It was clearly highly prized, maybe for its quality, but also its distinctive look.
Right.
Another important source was Lambay Island off the coast of Dublin, which produced axes made of porphyritic andesite.
And these axes traveled. They weren't just used locally.
Oh, they traveled widely. Axe production was a complex process, quarrying the raw stone, often using fire setting to help break it up. Then initial shaping, roughing out, often happened near the quarry.
Makes sense. Reduce the weight.
Exactly. Then these roughouts were transported, sometimes hundreds of kilometers. The final grinding and polishing, which was incredibly time-consuming, probably happened closer to where the axe would be used.
And we find them far from the source.
Yes. Tivabula and Rathlin porcelainite axes are found all over Ireland and even across the sea in Britain. It's clear evidence of extensive exchange networks. These weren't just tools moving, but likely ideas and social connections moving with them.
And their main job was?
Primarily woodworking. Absolutely essential for clearing those forests for farmland and for building the timber houses we talked about. Critical tools for the Neolithic way of life.
But you get the sense they were more than just tools.
Definitely. They seem to have held significant symbolic importance, too. We find them placed carefully in graves as offerings. Sometimes buried in hoards, groups of axes deliberately deposited in the ground, like the Malone hoard in Belfast, where large porcelainite axes were found placed upright.
Wow.
They turn up in other ceremonial contexts, too. The sheer effort needed to make one, the use of special, sometimes exotic materials sourced from specific places, the way they were treated and deposited, it all points to them being symbols of power, prestige, maybe status, or connection to ancestors or spiritual forces.
Right.
We even find perfectly made miniature axes, too small for practical use, maybe amulets or symbolic tokens.
A tool, but also a symbol. That's fascinating. What about other stone tools? Were they still making things like flint arrowheads?
Oh, absolutely. While the polished axes were vital for heavy work, tools made from flint and chert were the everyday toolkit for a huge range of tasks.
Such as?
We find beautiful leaf-shaped flint arrowheads, presumably for hunting or warfare. Larger javelin heads, too. Lots of different types of scrapers, hollow ones, round-nosed ones used for working hides, wood, bone. Sharp cutting tools like plano convex knives, and sickle blades, small flint flake set into wooden handles for harvesting grain.
Okay.
And interestingly, a distinctive large flint flake called a ban flake which actually originated way back in the Mesolithic, seems to have continued in use well into the Neolithic.
Tradition carrying on. How were these smaller tools made? Similar to Mesolithic techniques?
Largely, yes. Flint knapping. Skillfully striking a core of flint or chert to detach flakes of the desired shape and size. Techniques like direct percussion, hitting one stone with another, and pressure flaking, using bone or antler tools to apply pressure for finer shaping and sharpening.
Specialized techniques.
Yes, and sometimes adapted to the raw material. On Lambay Island, for instance, where the flint nodules might have been smaller, they used a technique called bipolar working, resting the core on an anvil stone while striking it.
Right. So axe factories in specific locations, but everyday tool making happening more widely. Where did they get the flint and chert?
Flint nodules could be found in various places, washed up on beaches, in river gravels, or mined directly from chalk deposits. County Antrim was particularly rich in high-quality flint.
So mostly local.
Often using local materials, yes. But there's also good evidence for the exchange of particularly good quality flint or finished tools made from it over significant distances, just like the axes.
And we have actual production sites where they were making these things.
Yes. We have the axe quarry sites themselves, Tiefbulia, Rathlin, Lambay, where you find quarrying pits, masses of waste material, roughouts, broken or unfinished axes, evidence of the whole production chain.
Okay.
And then at settlement sites, you find those lithic scatters or debitage concentrations, the waste flakes from making and resharpening the smaller tools. Tells you where that activity was happening. Lambay Island, again, is incredible. Over 15,000 chipped stone objects found, showing it was a major production center, not just for axes.
So the whole stone tool technology, it shows real sophistication, doesn't it? Understanding materials, specialized skills, complex exchange networks. And those axes, both practical necessities and potent symbols. Now, beyond the essential tools and pottery, what about smaller things? More personal items, jewelry, ornaments.
Yes, these smaller finds give us glimpses into, well, personal adornment, but also maybe status, beliefs. Things like beads, pendants, decorative pins, even elaborate stone mace heads. And they often turn up in graves or other ritual contexts.
Right. Tell me about the beads. What were they like?
Made from various materials. Stone was common. Shale beads were found in an early pit at Kilcolman, for example.
Right.
Steatite, or soup stone, was used too. Polished stone, also bone, and sometimes shell.
Later on.
Later in the Neolithic, we start to see the first use, maybe import, of rarer materials like jet, a black fossilized wood and amber. The forms were often simple discs or cylinders with a hole drilled through. Sometimes larger, more elaborate beads like the monster beads found in Britain might have Irish parallels.
And where do we find them?
Often as grave goods in the megalithic tombs. Both court tombs and passage tombs have yielded beads. They seem to be important personal possessions or maybe offerings to the dead.
Okay. And pendants. Similar materials.
Similar materials, yeah. Stone like jet, shale, steatite again, bone, antler. The forms could be quite varied. Sometimes simple shapes, maybe others were more elaborate, possibly representing things, although clear anthropomorphic or zoomorphic pendants aren't a major feature in the Irish Neolithic compared to some other areas. Again, often found in funerary contexts, like the passage tombs at Carrickeel.
Right. What about pins for clothing?
Bone pins, yes. Usually made from animal bone or sometimes red deer antler. Used presumably as fasteners for clothing or maybe in the hair. A very characteristic type found in passage tombs like Carrickeel and even Newgrange is the mushroom-headed pin.
A specific style again.
Exactly. Shows cultural connections between these major sites.
And those stone mace heads you mentioned, they sound different, not just ornaments.
No, they seem to be something else entirely. Often made from really high-quality stone, sometimes even beautiful flint, like the famous one from the Passage Tomb at Noath, or other fine-grained, visually striking stones.
What forms do they take?
Different shapes, ovoid, pestle-shaped. Some are highly decorated, like the Mazemore type, often made of flint, with carved spirals and lozenges. The Noath mace head is incredible, covered in intricate spirals, lozenges, designs that almost look like a human face.
Wow. Were they weapons?
Unlikely. They're generally interpreted as ceremonial objects, symbols of power, authority, prestige, not functional maces for hitting things.
Why do we think that?
Several reasons. The elaborate decoration, the use of often rare or difficult-to-work materials, the fact they're found in very high-status contexts, primarily the major passage tombs like Noath. The Noath mace head was deliberately buried in the eastern tomb chamber there. And we even find miniature versions, maybe worn as pendants, suggesting the symbolic power could be captured in smaller form.
So badges of office, almost?
Something like that. Regalia, indicating special status or ritual authority, probably made by specialist craftspeople, too.
So these small finds, beads, pendants, pins, mace heads, they really add another layer, don't they? Showing personal identity, social hierarchies, complex beliefs, all expressed through material culture. And finding things like jet or amber hints at those wider connections again.
And the mace heads.
Potent symbols indeed. Okay, we absolutely have to talk properly about the big stones now, the megaliths. For many people, this is the Irish Neolithic.
Understandably so. Those megalithic monuments, and there are over 1,600 known across Ireland, are arguably the most enduring and visually stunning legacy of the period.
More than just graves, right?
Oh, much more. While they often contain human remains, they were far more than just burial places. They were crucial centers for ritual, for ceremony. They were how Neolithic communities marked their territories, anchored their identities to the landscape, and connected with their ancestors and their cosmology.
How do we know that?
Well, think about the effort involved. Quarrying, moving, erecting massive stones, building huge mounds. This required enormous amounts of coordinated labor, planning, shared purpose. The very act of building and then repeatedly using these places, sometimes over many generations, would have been a powerful social process.
Bringing people together.
Exactly. Reinforcing social bonds, kinship ties, collective memory. Building and engaging with these monuments helped define who the community was and their relationship to the land and to the past. They were shaping a symbolic landscape, not just a physical one.
And you mentioned there are different types. It's not just one kind of dolmen.
Now, archaeologists generally classify them into four main types in Ireland, which appear at slightly different times and have different features. We have court tombs, portal tombs, passage tombs, and wedge tombs.
Okay.
Each has its own distinct architecture, typical distribution pattern, and often different kinds of artifacts found inside. They reflect regional traditions and changes in beliefs and practices over the long Neolithic period.
All right, let's take them one by one. Court tombs, you said they were early.
Yes, court tombs are among the earliest, appearing around 3800 BC, maybe lasting till 3500 BC. They're strongly associated with those initial farming communities.
What are their key features?
The defining feature is an open area at the front, the court, often semicircular or U-shaped, usually facing east. This court leads into a roofed burial gallery built with large stones and typically divided into two or more chambers by jamstones.
And this was all covered.
Originally, yes. The whole structure, court, and gallery was enclosed within a long, often trapezoidal-shaped mound or cairn made of smaller stones. Good examples are Creevykeel in Sligo or Ballyglass in Mayo.
Where do we find them? And what's inside?
They're mainly found in the northern half of Ireland, with a real density in the northwest, often in lowland areas near good farming land, suggesting a link to the settlements. Inside, burial was mostly cremation, sometimes multiple individuals' remains mixed together, though some unburnt bones, inhumations, are found too.
And grave goods.
Typical finds include that Western Neolithic pottery, especially Ballyalton bowls, flint tools like arrowheads and scrapers, sometimes polished stone axe fragments, and stone beads.
What was their purpose, do you think?
They seem to have been really important socio-ritual centers for these early farming groups, anchoring their community to a specific place, marking their claim to the land, honoring their dead. That open forecourt looks ideal for gatherings, ceremonies involving the wider community.
Okay. Next type, portal tombs, also called dolmens. They look very different.
They do. Portal tombs, or dolmens, likely developed from court tombs, maybe starting around the same time, 3800 BC, but perhaps lasting a bit longer, down to 3000 BC. Their most dramatic feature is that single, massive capstone.
Often tilted.
Often tilted, yeah. Resting on two tall, upright stones, the portal stones, which form an impressive entrance to a simple single chamber behind them. Sometimes there's a blocking stone or door stone between the portals.
Like Polnarbrone in the Burren.
Exactly like Polnarbrone, or the absolutely enormous Brownsill dolmen in Carlow. Its capstone weighs over 100 tons. Originally, these chambers were also covered by cairns, probably long ones, but often the cairn material is long gone, leaving just the stone skeleton.
Burial inside.
Yes, communal burial again. Polnarbrone, for instance, contained the remains of at least 22 people, interred over several centuries. Grave goods are similar to court tombs, Neolithic pottery, flint tools.
And their distribution?
Mainly northern half again, but also down the east coast into Leinster, Waterford. Interestingly, very similar tombs are found in Western Wales and Cornwall, pointing to those ongoing maritime links across the Irish Sea. They often occupy quite visible locations in the landscape.
Powerful statements.
Definitely. Visible symbols of the community's ability to command resources and labor, reverence for their dead, markers of identity and territory.
Right. Okay, now the really famous ones. Passage tombs. Newgrange, Noth, Douth.
Right.
These seem like a different level of complexity.
They absolutely are. Passage tombs represent a peak of megalithic architecture and, arguably, social organization in Neolithic Ireland. They flourish from about 3500 BC to maybe 2800 BC.
What defines them?
Key features are a large, usually circular mound or cairn built of earth and a co-stone. This covers a distinct passage built with large stones leading from the edge of the mound into a central chamber, which is also stone-built.
Different chamber shapes.
Yes, the chamber can be simple or undifferentiated, or it can have side recesses, often creating a cross shape like at Newgrange and Noth. These are called cruciform chambers. They often have massive curbstones surrounding the base of the mound, and the construction techniques like corbelled vaulting to roof the chambers are incredibly sophisticated.
And they occur in groups?
Often, yes, in large cemeteries. The most famous is Bruna Boyne in the Boyne Valley, Newgrange, Noth, Douth, and many smaller sites, but also major complexes at Loughcrew, further west in Meath, and Carramore and Carrickeel and Sligo. They tend to occupy prominent landscape positions, often on hilltops or ridges.
And the art. That's a huge feature, isn't it?
Megalithic art is a defining characteristic. Intricate patterns, spirals, circles, lozenges, chevrons, zigzags, wavy lines pecked or incised onto the structural stones, particularly the curbstones and the stones lining the passage and chamber.
What did it all mean?
We don't know for sure, of course, but it's almost certainly symbolic, religious, cosmological, maybe representing celestial bodies, ancestors, shamanistic visions, maps of the cosmos or the local territory. It's deeply complex.
And the alignments, Newgrange and the solstice.
Yes, the astronomical alignments are remarkable. Newgrange is precisely aligned so that the rising sun on the winter solstice shines down the passage through a special opening called the roof box to illuminate the central chamber.
Incredible.
And it's not just Newgrange. Noth has alignments related to the equinoxes and possibly lunar cycles. Loughcrew also has solar alignments. It shows a sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and a cosmology deeply connected to the sun and the seasons.
What about burials and finds?
Communal burial, again, mostly cremated remains, often vast quantities representing many individuals deposited over long periods. Grave goods are distinctive. That Carrickeel-ware pottery we discussed, those mushroom-headed bone and antler pins, carved stone pendants, enigmatic objects like decorated stone or chalk balls, deposits of white quartz, and often large, shallow stone basins within the chambers, maybe for offerings or holding remains.
The effort involved seems immense.
Colossal. Passage tombs represent huge investments of communal labor, sophisticated planning, engineering skills, specialized knowledge. They are clearly major ceremonial centers for large, well-organized communities, places for seasonal gatherings, rituals, feasts, all reinforcing social cohesion, identity, connection to ancestors and the cosmos. Someone called them cosmological theaters, where beliefs about life, death, and the universe were enacted. I like that.
Cosmological theaters, yeah, that captures it. Okay, finally, the wedge tombs. Bridging the Neolithic and Bronze Age, you said.
That's right. Wedge tombs are the latest major phase of megalithic tomb building, appearing around 2500 BC and continuing into the early Bronze Age, maybe down to 2000 BC.
What do they look like? How are they different?
Architecturally, they're a type of gallery grave. They have a main chamber or gallery which is wider and higher at the front, the entrance, and tapers getting narrower and lower towards the back. Hence the name wedge.
Okay.
The entrance typically faces west or southwest, which is different from the earlier types that often face east. They're built with upright stones, orthostats, roofed with stone slabs, and originally covered by a round or oval cairn.
Burials and grave goods.
Still communal burial, evidence for both cremation and inhumation. But the grave goods are where we see the transition happening. We find beaker pottery.
The new style.
Exactly. And also distinct flint arrowheads called barbed and tanged, which are typical of the Chalcolithic Copper Age and early Bronze Age. Sometimes deposits of white quartz, too, perhaps as offerings.
And where are they found? Are they common?
They're actually the most numerous type of megalithic tomb over 500 known. Found all over Ireland, but with major concentrations in the west and southwest, especially Clare and Cork. Interestingly, they're sometimes found near areas of early copper mining.
Ah, linking them to the dawn of metallurgy.
Precisely. They really mark that period of cultural change, perhaps the arrival of new people or influences bringing beaker pottery and the knowledge of metalworking.
So across all these tomb types, court, portal, passage, wedge, that practice of communal burial seems like the real constant thread. What does that tell us ultimately about their view of death?
It strongly suggests a collective approach. Death wasn't just about the individual, it was about the community, the lineage, placing ancestors together in these enduring stone monuments, often revisiting them, adding more burials over centuries. It speaks to a deep sense of continuity, of community identity tied to place and to past generations. These weren't just tombs, they were houses for the ancestors, focal points for memory and belonging.
Right. So bringing this all together, we've really covered an incredible arc of transformation in Neolithic Ireland, haven't we?
Absolutely. From the fundamental shift to farming, the arrival of new populations and ideas, the creation of settled communities in those timber houses,
The development of distinctive pottery and tools, those amazing polished axes.
and culminating in these truly monumental structures, the megaliths, which tell us so much about their complex social organization and belief systems.
These changes were just so profound, weren't they?
Yeah.
Really laying the foundations for everything that came after in Irish history.
Absolutely. The Neolithic irrevocably altered the landscape.
Right.
The way people lived, their social structures, their spiritual lives. It's a truly foundational period.
And, as we wrap up thinking about those megaliths still standing out there in the landscape today, it really makes you pause, doesn't it?
It does.
How does their enduring presence continue to shape how we see the past, how we connect to it? What bits of Neolithic life or belief, or that deep connection to place and ancestry, what might still resonate today, maybe in ways we don't even consciously realize?
It's a powerful thought, considering that long arc of human history on this island and our own place within it. It encourages that reflection on community, memory, and the human drive to make meaning and leave a mark.
A really compelling thought to end on. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Irish Neolithic archaeology.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating period.
I really hope you, listening, found it as illuminating and maybe thought-provoking as we did.